Right, are we on? That's the question. I can see, it says I'm live. G'day everybody, my name's Nathan Killick and this is the Camden Haven Anglican Church Drill Down. So happy to have you here this evening. The Drill Down is where we as a church think a bit more about the passage that was just preached last week, which you can see on our YouTube channel, and you can look at any of our previous services, all the ones to come, if you're ready for them, that is. And we just sort of talk about it, we think about it, we're just trying to make the most of every opportunity, see the Word of God, work hard at it, and think through a whole lot of stuff. So our question today is, what is the yeast of the Pharisees, and why should we look out for it? See you in a sec. Welcome back. Now we're looking at Matthew chapter 16. So if you have a Bible or if you have it open on your computer, then make sure it's there and able to be checked out. Let's see who we've got on today. If I do this, look at that, we'll see who's on there. So let's see. Want to say hello to Graham Cooper. He's got a question there. And Nathan Killick has said something. Good question. We've got Linda Frakes. Very jet lagged, but I'll try to keep up. We'll try to help you out there. Gary and Lois, and that's Graham Cooper, you're on, and that's good. And Greg Jamison is saying hello, everyone. So there's a bunch of people on. We'll come back and we'll see that. I've got to sort of dodge out of the way so I can see who is speaking. So we're going to jump into it. It's Matthew chapter 16. And we're going to jump right from the beginning, and let me work out, it's that one. There we go. I'll pop on there, grab my pen, and here we go. So the Matthew 16 says this, and the Pharisees, let me get this one, and the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test him, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. Now, a couple of things I want to point out here. I want to look at this word, to test, and we want to look at this word, to assign, and we might even think maybe about these two guys as well. So let's have a think about them. So first about these two guys, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were actually not friends, and they've come together, and it says here, to test Jesus. So, like as it said, that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, Jesus pretty much is both the Sadducees and the Pharisees' enemy, and they're out. They've combined forces, although not friends, to come against Jesus. So we've got the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they came, and look at that, to test Jesus. Now, just think about that word, to test Jesus. When you're thinking about the book of Matthew, the letter of Matthew, when is the last time you heard the word test? Have a think about it. When's the last time you heard the word test? Well, I'm going to give you a little hint, and we're going to pop back to, I'll open up this page and go back here. Jump on there and show you that. Look at that. Now, what have we got here? Jesus tested in the wilderness. Now, remember, that's a heading. We don't like headings, so we want to go into the actual text. And we see here, then Jesus was led by the Spirit in the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Now, that word tempted, let's see what that little A says at the bottom. Let's go to that. Look at that. The Greek for tempted can also mean tested. Dun, dun, dun. So when we're thinking about the Pharisees, I want to do that. When we're thinking about the Pharisees coming to test Jesus, they're coming to do what Satan has done in the desert. Now, let me just float something with you. Don't get too worried about this, what I'm about to say. The Binks are here. G'day, Team Binks. Good to have you guys here. the story of Jesus in the wilderness being tempted, is that something that actually happened? Well, you'll want to say, yeah, of course it did. The other option is, and it really doesn't matter too much, is it a story about what is going to happen in his time on earth, in the beginning of his ministry to the end of his ministry? It's going to be a time of testing. And those that test here are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They come to do what Satan has, what we know is in the background. This is the work of Satan doing this. So, I don't know. I just float that with you, see if that's okay. But what it is they came and they asked him to show them a what? A sign. Show us a sign. Now, you should be, having read Matthew, you should already be saying, hey, wait a minute, we've heard this before somewhere, and I want to show you. Let's have a look if we can find this. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 12. I think it's 12. Let's have a look. And let's scan down here. You know what I meant to look at? I meant not 12, but 19. That's it. Some Pharisees, here we go. Yes, of course. Some Pharisees came to test him. So the Pharisees testing, there is all this testing going on. Now they want to see a sign of the prophet Jonah, and that's why I want to go back to 12, because that's why I was on 12 before. Because this is sort of what has already happened. Here we go. Let's make that bigger so you can see it. Now we're in, don't go too far. Like I said here, we're in Matthew chapter 12, and we see this same thing happening. Then some of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law said to him, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." There's that sign again. And he answered, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but none will be given to it except the what? The sign of the prophet Jonah." Now, what was that sign? For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. I'm just going to give my audio slightly more here, so excuse me. So we'll just, sorry if you need to turn I've just turned myself up a bit. So we've got here the sign of Jonah in Matthew chapter 12 is the sign of him being in the belly of the whale or the fish, huge fish, for 3 days and 3 nights. And then we see in verse 41 here, the men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and now something greater than Jonah is here. So if we pop back to our text, we see here they're asking again. So we were back there in, what was it? Matthew 12. There was this idea of a sign there as well. So let me just check if anyone's had anything to say. Oh, we've got Alan and Cheryl Cooper. Let me pop that on so we can all see it. Alan and Cheryl Cooper are here. G'day, Alan and Cheryl. We're back in force. That's fantastic. Wonderful. And we'll pop back to our text now and jump in there. Oops, don't want to do that. Oh, look at that. There's 2 of me. So we've got here, there's a sign. They want to see a sign from heaven. Now, the sign in Matthew 12 was also the sign of Jonah. And we're going to see that the sign of Jonah is here again. This sign of Jonah is the sign that they are to see and understand. So we've got to work out what this sign of Jonah is. So verse 2, he answered them, "When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times." Now look at that. That idea, signs of the times, plural. This is often a a phrase that we use, isn't it? Can you read the signs of the times? And the signs of the times are clearly here in this passage being unpacked for us, so we're going to have to understand what these signs are. The Pharisees and Sadducees are asking for a sign. Jesus is saying, yeah, a sign from heaven. Jesus is saying, well, I've given you a sign. And we're going to see what that sign is in a moment. Just the whole idea there of, you know how to look to the heavens and see the sign. You look in the sky, red sky at night. What is it? Red sky in the morning, sailor's warning. Red sky at night, sailor's delight. Something like that. I think Simon used shepherd's delight, so maybe that's a delight for shepherds as well. It's going to be a good day tomorrow or a bad day today, whatever. So as well as you can tell the weather, he said it should be just as clear to see the signs from heaven. And this sign, but notice what this sign is. It's an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah, which means there will be a sign given to it, but the sign given to it is the sign of Jonah. So he left them and departed. Now, we're meant to think back, and we're meant to say, well, that was back there in chapter 12, the sign of Jonah, back there in chapter 12 of Matthew, and it was talking about the descent and of Jesus into the earth and then back out of the grave, and then the Ninevites repenting, and the Ninevites standing up as a sign against that generation as people who rejected Jesus. So here is what the sign of Jonah is. The sign of Jonah is, think about Jonah. Jonah is sent to the Gentiles. So Nineveh, and Nineveh is converted. What we see is also that the idea of Jesus being in the earth and rising up. We know later on that's going to mean he's paying the penalty for sin, rising to new life to offer that freely to everybody, and that the Gentiles are the object of this forgiveness. And the Old Testament looked forward to and promised a time when there would be lots of Gentiles pouring in to the kingdom. And what the Pharisees should see is that sign. And what we had just previously, didn't we, in chapter 15? Remember the story of the Canaanite woman, or the Canaanite, the dog woman. She's a Canaanite. She's a Gentile. She's enemy of enemy, that sort of thing. We also found the feeding of the 4,000, the bread and the fish there, and this was on Gentile territory. Here is the feeding of the Gentiles as well. And so here is the sign that the Pharisees should see. This is the sign of Jonah, that like in Jonah, preaching converted Gentiles, now we've got Jesus converting Gentiles. That is the sign that they ought to see. So let's jump back into the text. That is what he's saying. So he left them and departed. Okay, now we've got the next bit. When the disciples reached the other side, that is the other side of the lake, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Now, I don't know if you've ever been out and forgotten bread. It's not great. When you get home, did you get bread? Oh, I forgot. Back out, get the bread. Jesus said to them, and here's the important thing, Jesus said to them, watch out and beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now remember, the Pharisees and Sadducees just spoken to him just above here. They came to test him and asked him to show them signs. So he said, watch out for this yeast. And they began to discuss, and they began discussing among themselves, saying, we brought no bread. Now, I think we're meant to laugh at this. The disciples, Peter and the disciples, regularly display themselves in the Gospels not as the heroes of the story, but as the dumb ones. They're the ones of little faith. They're the ones who don't know what's going on. Now, we know what's going on, but they don't know what's going on. But we're watching them learn, and it's helpful for us because, plenty of us are dum-dums. So it's sort of comforting in a way. Let's see who else is here. We've got the apostles are back, Simon and Nicole. Great to see you guys back again. So we've got Simon and Nicole and Alan and Cheryl and who else? Oh, Team Binks, of course. Tom and Libby. Greg's there. Graham, maybe Jeanette as well in the background somewhere. Lois. Where have we got? Lois and Gary. Fantastic. Linda seems to be had a trip recently. I don't know what she's been doing. And we've got Graham Cooper. Now, Graham Cooper's asked a question. Can you see this question here? Now, I think I can do this. No, I thought it was going to... There it is. Early question. Big one. Is not a Jewish tradition to eat only unleavened bread? And if that is so, why would the disciples think of bread and not say beer when Jesus spoke to them about yeast? Now, I don't know if anybody else in the world has ever asked that question, but it's telling that that question is from an Aussie. Got beer on the brain. Heather Wiegand's just popped on. G'day, Heather. Good to see you. So I would want to say that it wasn't that the Jewish people didn't eat yeast. It was that there was a period in the year that they didn't eat yeast. And so that would have been coming up to the Exodus, to the Passover. So remember in Exodus chapter 12, they were told not to have yeast because yeast is what you put into bread and you have to keep it in there to let it rise. Basically, to not have yeast was to say, we haven't got time to let this thing rise. We need to eat unleavened bread. So eating unleavened bread is to say we're not waiting. We're getting into this straight away. To have leaven at that time was to therefore not be ready. It was to be waiting for your bread to rise. You wouldn't have been able to race out at that moment that the angel of death passed over, and that you were able to rush out and be able to escape. So in some sense, yeast came to mean in that time of year the type of half-heartedness. And so yeast was picturesque there of that sort of thing. So we're gone across the lake, and I'm going to pop back to there and jump on there. And we're looking out for the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees, and we've got to work that out. Now, the disciples think Jesus is saying, Jesus is upset that we didn't bring bread. No, here's what Jesus says. But aware of this, I don't know that. But Jesus, aware of this, said, "O you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread?" Now, he's about to tell them, let's just read on and we'll see what he says. Do you not yet perceive? So they're trying to work out here what is the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Remember before that was it there. So we've got the yeast, the Pharisees and Sadducees coming, and then we've got watch out and beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. And now they're trying to work out what that means. Now he's going to explain what it means. Now, if we go right down to 12, then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the yeast of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So just to pop back to Graham's question, I'm just thinking again, they would have used yeast in other times, and I don't know, I suppose they would have used yeast in beer, but there was a lot of talk about bread, so I think they would have related it to that. Jesus did supply all the wine at the wedding though, didn't he? Anyway. Now, here we have the ants, we have that they're working out that they understood that he did not tell them about the yeast of bread, but the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees is the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, how did the disciples get to that point, to understand that? Because it says here, doesn't it? Then they understood. Then they understood. Whatever he has said here in these verses has caused them to then understand that he was talking not about bread, the yeast of bread, but about this teaching. So let's have a look at these verses. What is going on in these verses? What is making them realize in verses 8 to 11? How do these verses convince the disciples that Jesus was talking about teaching? Okay, that's what we're going to look at now. They think he's talking about bread. Now, I understand that because I'm a bit of a dummy sometimes. He was talking about bread a lot, wasn't he? So it wouldn't be unusual for them to think, he's talking about bread, the yeast in bread. But what he says now in these verses helps them understand he's not talking about bread, he's talking about teaching, not talking about yeast, but teaching. Let's see how it comes out. First of all, let me read it, and then let's look at the numbers in this. Do you not yet perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000, and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, and how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand I did not speak about bread? Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the yeast of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now the problem is, he's just talked all about bread. What about you? Would you feel like, you've just talked about bread, I'm sure you mean bread. You've talked about all the bread that you fed people with and all the leftover bread. How is it, I understand how they said bread, how is it that they understand then it's about teaching? Well, first of all, to find this, let's do this. Let's have a look at the numbers that we see here. Let's hear. Do you not remember the 5 loaves? So let me highlight that. 5 loaves for the 5,000, and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, and how many baskets you gathered? Now remember, it seems here that these numbers are being pointed to pretty specifically. What are these numbers about? What is going on? Well, let's look at the numbers. The first thing to ask is here, where he says, how many baskets did you gather? Now I want to underline that. How many baskets did you gather? And then again, how many baskets did you gather? See, he's pointing out not only how many were fed, but drawing attention to how many baskets were left over. What's going on? How does this get the disciples to think, he's talking about teaching? Well, first of all, let's think about some of these numbers. We've got here, let me change the colour of that to, let's make it blue. Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000, or the 7 loaves for the 4,000? Let's just think about bread for a minute. He said, don't you remember the 5 loaves and the 7 loaves? Give you some time to think here. 5 loaves, 7 loaves. 5 plus 7 equals what? 12. 12, we know, is a significant number. Notice, by the way, the focus is on the bread, not on the fish. We don't hear about the fish anymore. Fish have been cancelled. They're out. Here we've got importance about numbers. Yeah, 12. Joanne calls here. G'day, Joanne. 12 tribes, 12 disciples, 100%. So, but it's 12 tribes. It's 12, but it's embracing two groups. Here are the 5 loaves that fed 5,000 Jews, and here are 7 loaves that fed 4,000 Gentiles. Put those loaves together, it is as if Jesus is saying that the Jewish and the Gentile are going to come together to make a new Israel. There is a new 12 tribes coming together. Maybe that's it. Now you might think, oh, that's a bit of a stretch. Well, I want to say it might be a stretch, but when we're drawn attention, specific attention to the numbers, we've got to ask ourselves, why is our attention being drawn to this? And this 5 and 7 equaling 12 actually matches quite well with the context that we've been looking at before, where Jews are coming in and Gentiles are coming in. There is a new people being created, and the 12 tribes now are reflected by people from every tribe and language and nation. So even in Revelation, I was looking at Revelation with a friend on Monday night, and it looks at the 144,000 Jews, then a multitude of Gentiles from every tribe and language and nation. Now, some people say those numbers are the same thing. They are significant. They're symbolic of the same thing. And here that sort of begins to say that. So let's say those are those numbers that we looked at. But have a look at then, because he draws attention to what else? He draws attention to how many baskets you gathered. Now, how many baskets were left over when Jesus fed the 5,000? How many baskets were left over when Jesus fed the 5,000? So should we look that up? Where is that? That's in chapter 15, isn't it? So I'm just going to open up chapter 15 here. Is it chapter 15? Oh, no, chapter 14. Chapter 14 for the 5,000. Here we go. So I'm just going to jump that on here, pop on there. Let's have a look. There we go. Oops. Now, here we go. We pop down here. We've looked at this story and... oh, how many baskets left over? That's behind my head, isn't it? So I'm going to pop away there. Oh, boom, choom. 12 baskets left over. 12 baskets left over. Now, the significance, I think, there is, again, 12 baskets left over. 12 represents Jesus, represents Israel. And now let's pop forward to the feeding of the 4,000 here. And how many basketfuls were left over? The number of those who then they after the disciples picked up how many? 7. 7 basketfuls of broken pieces. Now, what is going on? We've got 12 basketfuls left over. We've got 7 basketfuls left over. Again, in these stories, there is attention drawn to those numbers. And now Jesus in chapter 16 is drawing attention to those numbers. The 12 representing the 12 tribes of Israel, the full of Israel, and the 7 representing the 7 nations that inhabited Israel before Israel moved in, before the Israelites moved in on the land of Canaan. There were 7 nations there, and they had to overtake those 7 nations, and one of those nations was Canaan, Canaanites, and they're the Canaanite woman who came out to Jesus. So, how you going? You're working on this with me? Let's keep checking it out. Let's keep it in front of us, because we're trying to work out, how did the disciples work out that Jesus was talking about teaching and not bread? And so we've got to work out, what is the teaching in this passage. And the teaching in this passage is what? The teaching in this passage is Jesus is saying, remember that the bread of the children is beginning to overflow to the nations. Remember the Canaanite woman? I think she's a very special woman. She is the woman who says to Jesus, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And this is what's beginning to happen. The nations are being fed. Remember, 7 represents the Gentiles, the nations. 12 represents Israel. And so there is this teaching here that's happening in this event that is saying to the disciples, he is talking about new Israel. He is talking about the Gentiles coming in. Now, what we want to say that all along so far we have found that the Pharisees are the ones who are keeping the Gentiles out of the kingdom. So let's have a look very quickly at one of those. That's Matthew 23. Let me show you that one. Pop on there. So this is a whole rant of Jesus against the Pharisees. And look at this. Here we go. Verse 13. Woe to you, teachers of the law, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those who are trying to. And this goes on and on. It calls them blind guides, hypocrites, making them children of hell, and all those sorts of things. So what we've got here is the disciples are realizing that the sign that the Pharisees and Sadducees should be seeing is the Gentiles hearing the preaching of the Messiah and coming into the kingdom, which is what they're always looking forward to in the Old Testament. They are receiving the bread that is falling. They're finally receiving the bread that's falling from the Master's table, Jesus' table. He is feeding them. There is these 12 full Israel is coming in. 7, the nations are coming in. They're coming in to make a new body, which we know is called the church. And it's not a replacement of Israel, but it's including the Gentiles. So it's not a replacement theory, but an inclusion theory. So it's a fulfillment theory followed by inclusion theory. So Jesus is the fulfillment, and then he sees them coming in. The disciples are to watch out, therefore, for the teaching that excludes the Gentiles from coming in to the kingdom of heaven, because the sign of the Gentiles coming in is the sign that the Messiah is there and that it's the end of the age. This is beginning to happen now in the first century with Jesus. And it's happening right in front of the disciples' eyes. Now, what is the application to all of this? What is the application? Well, first of all, there is application to the disciples. They are to be careful of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They are to be careful of the teaching that excludes the Gentiles from coming in. They are to be careful of the teaching of law. They are to be careful of the teaching that has not seen its fulfillment in Jesus. Remember Matthew chapter 5? I'm not going to just say remember it. I'm going to say we should look at it. So I'm going to pop to, Matthew 3, and then we'll go 4 and 5. And then we see here, what did Jesus come to do? Do not think I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So here this fulfillment is going on, and the disciples are to be, as it says in chapter 13, and I've even highlighted it, there we go. He said to them, "Every teacher of the law who has become a disciple of the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old." This is talking about the disciples. So the application to the disciples is, don't listen, be aware of the teaching of the of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, teaching that is keeping the Gentiles out of the kingdom, and not listening, not wanting to see the sign that the Messiah has arrived, not wanting to see that Jesus is the Messiah. It's very significant. And that what they are to do is to become these teachers. They've been instructed in the kingdom of heaven. The other thing there is just to remember that chapter 5 of Matthew, very important. He's not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. What is the application? We know the application, therefore, is for the apostles, and not, when I say the apostles, I don't just mean Simon and Nicole. The implication for the apostles is to make sure that the message they preach is the one that says the end of the age has come. The Gentiles are now pouring into the kingdom. We need to speak for them. Now, if you read through Acts, what is the big issue? The big issue is, how are the Gentiles included? Do they have to become Jews, or is it by faith? And we find it's by faith. Big issue in Acts, and it's all bubbling along in the background here. So there is the application for the disciples. What's the application for us from this passage? Well, not surprisingly at all, the application for us is simply this: listen to the apostolic teaching. I'm sorry, there's no more than that. That is the application for us. So it is there. Don't listen to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, their yeast. Don't take in their yeast. It is listen to the scribes of the teachers of the law who have been instructed in the kingdom of heaven, which is the disciples. And that's why we weekly look at a passage from the Bible, and that's why we want to really look at the Gospels and listen to the epistles and to the Bible teaching us about what's going on here. Listen to him when in Matthew chapter 3, when Jesus is baptized, the word is, "This is my son whom I love, with him I am well pleased." And then when this happens again on the Mount of Transfiguration, "This is my son whom I love, listen to him." God saying, listen to him. Now, how do we listen to Jesus? Well, Jesus has said to his apostles, you need to be people to teach what I've said. It comes right at the end of Matthew's Gospel, doesn't it? "Go and make disciples of all nations," what? "Teaching them to obey all I have commanded you, and behold, I'm with you always to the very end of the age." So our job, our application from this, is to make sure we're people who listen to the apostolic teaching. And that's exactly what we're doing on the drill down every single week. Now let me just pop back here, see if there's any questions before we say goodbye. No, looks all right. It's a good bunch here tonight. Well, it's been really good to have you. I wanted to show you something before I go. I just cleaning out my garage and found this. Do you know what this is? It's a grip meter. Turn it on. You put your age in. Oh, whoops. That wasn't meant to happen. I didn't have grip on it, did I? Oh, look at that. Here we go. I had to put my age in there. Can you see that? I don't know if you can see that. Anyway, it says I'm 54. And you're meant to grab it. You're meant to start. And then you're meant to begin to pull it. Grip it. And look what I got. I got 49.7. I can just see that there, 49.7. And on the grip, on the thing here, it says, oh yeah, if you're 54 and you get, I'm almost strong. I'm in the above average. That's nice to be above average. But anyway, I'm at least in the normal factor there in the normal factor. So anyway, the reason I show you this is because we got to get a grip on the Bible. Doesn't matter how strong your hands are, we've got to get a grip on the apostles' teaching. So let me encourage you. Keep coming along on Wednesday night. Keep listening. Or keep going to a Bible growth group. Keep coming to church on Sunday, because it's not just about you, it's about others. And we need you to be there and to be able to encourage others to be listening to the apostles' word. So that's where we are. It's great to see you tonight. I'm going to say fantastic, awesome. See you next week as we look at such an amazing passage. Next week, I will build my church, Jesus said. Lots of good stuff. I'm going to be tempted to rave on endlessly, so you might even have to pause it or leave or something like that. Anyway, good to see you, and I'll see you later.